lecture recital. I have had a lot of fun as well as a fair share of frustrations in preparing and learning the Hexameron. And I'm very excited to share with you today this adrenaline-pumping crowd pleaser, as well as the backdrop of its conception. Before I begin, I would just like to express my gratitude to the many teachers, friends, and family who have been so helpful and inspiring during the course of my doctoral studies. And special thanks go to my advisor, Dr. Michael Griffel, and to my piano teacher, Mr. Jerome Lowenthal. And of course, to my endlessly supportive family, thank you for seeing me through to this day. The idea of piano virtuosos is, I suspect, quite appealing to many people. After all, everyone enjoys a spectacle, being awed and dazzled by seemingly superhuman feats and displays of specialization. While history is rife with stories of instrumental virtuosos, it was in Paris in the 1830s that flashy pianists came to the forefront of the musical scene and secured the piano as the king of all instruments. This afternoon, I would like to explore with you the musical landscape of Paris during the 1830s and how that contributed to the rise of the first documented concentration of piano virtuosos. And I will use a virtuosic showpiece, intriguingly titled Hexameron, as a vehicle to introduce some of the most important pianists of that day and investigate the craft of their trade. The period from 1830 to 1848 in Paris is known as the July Monarchy, bookended by the July Revolution in 1830, during which the oppressive reign of King Charles X was overthrown, and by the revolutions of 1848 across Europe as people rose against monarchical rule. The July Monarchy was a period of relative political stability. It was led by its superficial mascot, Louis Philippe, the so-called bourgeois king. He had learned from the examples of his predecessors to appease his constituents by staying away from extremes. Thus, he walked the narrow path of the juste milieu, the middle ground, between rightist royalists on one side, who favored restoration of traditional absolute monarchy, and leftist republicans who favored representational government. Compared to Charles X's reign before his, Louis Philippe's was a liberal era, which attracted artists and intellectuals of all types, although his lukewarm attitude incensed young radicals, Franz Liszt among them. The July Monarchy really belonged to the middle class, that heterogeneous mass of people who had slowly but steadily gained ascendancy in society since the French Revolution some 40 years earlier. By the July Revolution of 1830, the middle class had overtaken the world of finance, and during the July Monarchy, they sought to overtake the world of culture. Central to the principles of the money-making crowd of the middle class was the notion that careers should be open to all talents, that one's wealth or birth should not dictate one's privileged access to employment. With the abolition of seigneurial rights and the feudal system during the French Revolution, the possibility of achievement through personal hard work became more and more of a reality. As more people had acquired their own wealth and rose through the ranks of society in such a manner, there were more resources available for the enjoyment of leisure activity. As well, more employment opportunities were available thanks to the rise of the Industrial Revolution. Opera continued to be the most popular form of musical entertainment. The genre had survived the transition of regimes from the absolute monarchy of old France to the empire of Napoleon to constitutional monarchy of the 1830s. Even as the target audience shifted and storylines evolved, opera remained a national pastime and often a political platform for propaganda. In the 1830s, opera was very much a form of entertainment for the masses, embodying sentiments of republicanism and patriotism. It was also in the 1830s that a craze for Italian opera was sparked, its main composers being Rossini, Bellini, and Donizetti. Operas provided fertile ground for material that the Parisian piano virtuosos could capitalize upon in their compositions. It must be remembered that at this time, being a composer necessarily came with the job of being a pianist. Taking memorable tunes from popular operas, something at once familiar to and supported by many people, and incorporating these tunes into piano pieces provided a way for people to take a part of the opera with them away from the theater. Amateur pianists, of which there were many in Paris, would seek out these compositions for their own practicing pleasure as well as for the entertainment of others. The piano virtuosos would weave their own magic around these tunes, composing pieces known as operatic fantasies or variation sets as the staple of their performing repertoire. It was also equally valid for music publishers to commission operatic fantasies, sometimes based on melodies from unsuccessful operas, as a way to recover some of their monetary losses from an opera's disappointing performance. As the middle class continued to grow in size and power, the piano also grew in popularity. Many factors, some subtle, some more direct, contributed to this trend. Most obviously, as the middle class grew, more people had the means to afford to buy a piano, take lessons, purchase sheet music, and attend concerts. A survey in an influential Parisian periodical in 1845 estimated the number of pianos in Paris at 60,000, or about one piano for every 5 households. Not only was there a growing interest in all things piano, it was also considered fashionable to dally in the arts, and it was a way for people to flaunt their wealth. In fact, buying tickets to expensive seats at a concert was one of the principal ways that audiences of the July monarchy could show off their social standing. Also, as time went on, learning music became not just a pastime and a mark of good upbringing, but more of a competitive sport. The satirist Albert Clare wrote in 1853, quote, "In recent years, each family takes pride in having within it one or more small virtuosos. The piano, violin, flute, and even clarinet have replaced such youthful amusements as dolls, hula hoops, and balls. The study of solfège is substituted for the reading of Mother Goose stories. Children are distributed slices of music instead of bread and jam," end quote. Although there were an increasing number of serious music aficionados, the majority of audiences was largely uncultured in music appreciation, and to keep them entertained, concerts tended to be in the potpourri style, including a little bit of everything, from operatic numbers to solo instrumental pieces to symphonic movements. The highlight was very often the virtuosic pieces based on opera tunes. Also helping the promotion of such piano pieces were the technological advances made to the piano itself. It was around this time that the piano began to take on the size, shape, and functions that we are used to on a modern grand piano. In 1821, the quintessential development of the double escapement action was invented, allowing for rapidly repeating notes and greater possibilities of shading in tone production. The use of felt-covered hammers rather than leather or cotton-covered also helped to increase the dynamic range on the instrument, creating more dramatic contrasts. The range of notes was also gradually expanded to eventually reach more than an octave higher in the upper register and several notes lower in the bass register. Composers latched onto these innovations and showcased these improved abilities by writing brilliant passage work utilizing the upper registers of the piano, as well as musical lines that required unprecedented clarity, delicacy, and precision, the hallmarks of virtuosic music. It was within this musical setting that the Hexameron was born in the heyday of the piano virtuosos. In March 1837, Cristina Belgiojoso, an Italian princess living in Paris as a refugee and who was known for hosting salons for Paris's elite crowds, held a 3-day charity event for Italian political refugees. As part of the event, she commissioned a set of piano variations based on a theme of her own choosing from the Italian opera I Puritani by Vincenzo Bellini, who was incidentally her former piano teacher. And she requested each of 6 of the period's best-known virtuoso pianist composers to write one variation. The honored pianist composers who were asked to participate in this collaboration were Franz Liszt, Sigismund Thalberg, Johann Pixis, Henry Hertz, Karl Czerny, and Friedrich Chopin. The princess's original idea was to have each pianist present to perform his own variation. However, the contributions were not completed in time, and instead, Liszt and Thalberg were present at the charity in person and engaged in their now famous piano duel to cap off the event. Even though Hexameron did not receive its originally intended performance, it did eventually come together with Princess Belgiojoso's relentless hounding of the composers and with Liszt assuming the role of overall editor. To him fell the task of organizing the variations into a logical order and tying them together as a cohesive whole. I would like to point your attention now to the handout, which gives the breakdown of Hexameron by several categories. And looking down the column of the composers, you can see that Liszt was a major contributor to the piece as a whole. He wrote the introduction, the theme, the second variation, 3 interludes, which are sections of music between the variations and are not based on the main opera melody, as well as the finale. Before I talk about Liszt's contributions, I would like to look at the variations of each of the other composers first. The theme from the opera that is used as the basis of this set of variations is a duet sung by baritone and bass to the words, "Sound the trumpet for liberty." This text would have resonated particularly well with the princess as a political refugee and nicely fit the purposes of her charity event. As well, the martial character of this music was very much in vogue in Paris at this time, and it was commonplace to associate instrumental virtuosos with military rulers. Altogether, it was a very appropriate theme to use for this set of virtuoso variations. I'd like to play for you now an excerpt from that duet. This rousing tune later became the anthem for the Sicilian independence movement. Now, Thalberg's variation was placed first. At this time in history, Thalberg was arguably a more popular pianist and composer than Liszt was in Paris. And one of the gimmicks that Thalberg was most well known for was the so-called three-handed effect. By distributing a melody line between the thumbs of both hands and encircling the melody above and below with filler passages, Thalberg created the auditory illusion that there were actually three lines of music going on at the same time. Of particular novelty was that this created a melody in the tenor or middle register, which was different from the more popular soprano melodies. Although he was not the only one who used this effect, Thalberg certainly used it the most often and wowed audiences with it time and again. In the middle section of his variation, he uses a similar effect. So you'll hear it sounds like this. Pixis is perhaps the least well-known of the Hexameron composers today, although in his day, he was a respected performer and teacher coming from a musically talented family. In musicologist Jeffrey Kahlberg's estimation, Pixis, quote, seems to have aimed his fantasies at the moderately talented amateur market, end quote. Yet the variation that he contributed is quite difficult in its use of rapid octave runs and leaps in both hands, and when played accurately is quite brilliant sounding. So this is how the beginning of Pixis's variation will sound. Hertz, who was once accused of being the trendsetter for the virtuoso style of playing, was often criticized for his shallow music, but was loved by amateur pianists because of his manageable yet challenging sounding pieces. True to form, he contributed possibly the least technically demanding variation. The only difficulty is in maintaining the melody of the theme, which is rhythmically disjointed and carried by the thumbs of the left hand. So you'll hear in Hertz's variation the melody in the left hand. Obviously, it sounds broken, but with the right hand providing filler material, it'll be glossed over to sound this way. Among the six composers, Czerny stood out as the misfit. The second oldest in the group, he could count Liszt and Thalberg among his pupils. He never lived in Paris, and he was not particularly known as a performing virtuoso. Rather, he was known more as a teacher, and today he is primarily remembered for the literally hundreds of exercises he composed for the piano. And that side of him shows through in his variation. It seems more like a hodgepodge of different techniques and challenges, as if he were condensing several piano exercises from his voluminous output into one. Virtually every two measures feature a different technical hurdle. So it will begin with wide left-hand leaps and right-hand octaves. Against a melody carried in the left hand. Etc. The lyrical Chopin exemplified the opposite characteristics of his more flamboyant contemporaries. He projected the mystique of the romantic virtuoso and likewise delivers an exotically dreamy and tender number. His variation, coming last, forms the obligatory slow movement of variation form. Also a master manipulator of harmonies, Chopin contributed the only variation in the key of E major and harmonically related to the home key of A flat major. So our main opera tune is in A flat, sounds like this. Chopin turns that into this. Just as each of the variations bears the signature of its composer, so the entire piece is heavily permeated with Liszt trademarks, as he was the primary caretaker of this composition. From the outset, Liszt begins the introduction with an original theme of his own creation. And as you can see from the musical example on the handout in the introduction, this theme is comprised of a descending dotted rhythm figure in 3/4 time. And this complements the main theme, which is an ascending dotted figure in 4/4 time. Descending figure, although written in 3/4 time, can be very easily misheard as being in 4/4, which works out very well because, as it turns out, Liszt is going to combine these two themes within the introduction. So you'll hear the right hand with the main opera theme, the ascending line, and the left hand will take the descending line, or Liszt's theme. Together it sounds this way. Throughout the rest of the piece, in every interlude and in the finale, this descending figure will serve as a foil for the main opera theme. As musician and writer Arthur Lesser has pointed out, by the 1830s, it had become necessary to dress up the variation set with an attention-grabbing introductory section, rather than pedantically begin with a statement of the theme, in order to satisfy the money-paying audiences who demanded the pleasures of the sensational. You will notice as well, from the musical incipit of the introduction, an alternate option written for pianos that had a 6-octave range. This indication orients us immediately to the fact that the piano as an instrument was undergoing some dramatic changes at this time. Liszt's intention was to write for the newly extended 7-octave keyboard, but not every instrument had that capacity at the time. Within the rather lengthy introduction, Liszt is keen to display his compositional virtuosity through the use of appealing and unexpected harmonic shifts and colorings. At last, after a series of thundering E-flat octaves up and down the keyboard, the official main theme in A-flat major is stated. The texture that Liszt uses for this theme is quite similar to that used in his piece Funerai, and it features octaves in the left hand and a dotted rhythm theme in the right hand. In Hexameron, the theme sounds this way. Compare that with Funerai. During the statement of the theme, Liszt also uses a characteristic cadenza-like passage that runs the length of the keyboard down and up, another of his favorite gestures, found, for example, also in his concert etude Un Sospiro. Now that gesture in question in Hexameron is this. And compare that with un sospiro. Another of Liszt's trademark compositional devices is the use of sections of music marked recitativo, borrowing from the operatic term that depicts sections of musical speech. Such rhythmically free sections are found in Liszt's B minor piano sonata, the first Hungarian Rhapsody, and in the Hexameron in the introduction and second interlude. In order to tie the whole piece together, Liszt incorporated material from the variations by Thalberg, Hertz, and Pixis into the finale to form, as pianist Raymond Lewenthal has said, quote, a sort of giddy can-can, end quote. Toward the end of the finale, Liszt achieves heightened intensity through the structural use of an augmented triad. The use of augmented triads is another commonly found feature in Liszt's music. What happens in Hexameron is essentially we have a D-flat augmented triad, and within 6 measures, Liszt will harmonize each pitch of that triad, so that with each new harmonization, a new tonality is explored and a new high is reached. So in that section, begins with the harmonization of the pitch F. That's D flat. And finally A. At the very end of the finale, Liszt uses this technique again, but with a different augmented triad and a faster harmonic rhythm to escalate to the final climax. It is also worth mentioning that Liszt was thinking very much in terms of concerto form for the Hexameron. In the first interlude, the word ritornello is written into the score, referring to a tutti passage in concerto form. There is, in fact, an incomplete concerto score in Liszt's hand of the Hexameron, as well as evidence of a 2-piano version which Liszt performed with Clara Schumann. Liszt was working on sketches of his own piano concertos around the same time that he was working on Hexameron, which may have influenced his thinking. The first time the Hexameron was performed in its entirety was in December of 1837, 9 months after the charity event for which it was originally intended. The presumably successful premiere was given by Liszt in Italy, and he was to continue to program the piece with some regularity for the remainder of his performing career. Hexameron does not claim to be the most sophisticated work of high art, but rather a piece of mass entertainment, which I believe it does deliver. Indeed, some of its more melodramatic sections may seem over the top and perhaps even humorous in context, and that's okay. So now I invite you to imagine yourself transported to the world of piano virtuosos of the 1830s in Paris, hearing Hexameron for the very first time. Please enjoy. imagine the effect this piece would have had on an audience that was craving stimulation of the senses. With this one piece, it was as if audiences were receiving a postcard from each of the best virtuosos of the day. And to top it off, the piece was performed by the iconic piano virtuoso Liszt himself. Today, this piece is a seldom heard novelty, but I, for one, am a promoter of this piece, not only for its entertainment value and the physical workout it affords to the performer, but also for its testament to the culture of the Parisian piano virtuosos. Thank you very much. I'd be happy to take any questions at this time. Yes?
Well, first of all, thank you very much for a terrific presentation and beautiful performance.
Thank you.
That was really great. Just a couple of things occurred to me as you were talking that you might want to look into as you pursue this lecture, which I hope you will give many times. One is one of the reasons for all of this incredible figuration was that there were some serious copyright issues at the time, and there was a kind of code of how much you had to add to something to not get sued for copyright infringement. It sounds just like today, but it was pretty bad. Another thing that's really interesting about that period is that the price of paper was dropping very quickly, and with it, newspapers were expanding enormously, and they all had critics.
Yeah.
And I think without that, this virtuoso culture would have had a lot more difficulty really getting going, but it's absolutely amazing to see how more and more people start writing about music. And of course, most of it's utter rubbish, but it is really a lot of fun to see. The other thing is, I'm curious, do you happen to have the dates of birth handy of all these guys?
Yes, I do.
Could you
Sure. Well, let's see. Well, Liszt was, of course, 1811 to 1886. Thalberg was 1812 to 1871. Pixies was the oldest of the group. He was 1788 to 1874. Hertz, 1803 to 1888. Czerny, 1791, the year Mozart died, to 1857. And Chopin, 1810 to 1849.
Yeah, because you might want to point out that actually there's an incredible difference in style between the older guys and the younger guys.
Yes.
There are just as many notes, but it's so strikingly diatonic when you hear the older ones writing that must have been also very striking to the Parisian audience who knew all this so well.
Yeah, it's a very good point.
Yeah, thank you again.
Thank you. Yes?
Hi. Did Hollywood adapt some of these sounds to silent movies?
That's a very good question. I am not aware particularly of this piece. I don't know if it was ever used, but there were so many pianists in that time period did so many fantasies of opera tunes, many of which actually had similar themes, so it's very possible that you might have heard this or something else that sounded very similar to it. But I don't know, yes?
Does the manuscript still exist? Is it scattered?
I don't know where it exists altogether, but yes, it is extant on its own. I'm not sure where though.
After this prematurely stopped playing, what's the history of performance of this piece?
That is a question that I tried looking into and I haven't been able to ascertain. I couldn't follow the trajectory of its performance. And in looking through performing programs, I've only seen Liszt program the piece himself. But as I mentioned, it has been told that he performed a two-piano version of it with Clara Schumann. So, yes?
Do you have a general preference for the Fazioli, or did you choose it specifically for this piece, and if so, why?
Well, when I came in for my dress rehearsal yesterday, this was the piano that was there. But I did try the other Steinway that's backstage, and that one is a little bit harder to play on to get the tone production, so I thought for this piece it would be nicer or less taxing on myself to use the Fazioli. Any further questions?
Was it played on an Erard piano originally?
I assume it was because Liszt was a fan of the Erard piano. He was its promoter, so I would assume it was. Yes, Mr. Sutton.
Just one last thing, which is it's interesting that they didn't think to ask Hummel Right. He was only slightly older than the oldest, but he's already considered very old-fashioned.
Yes, that's true. Well, this was also right around the time that Hummel died,
Was getting sick. Yeah.
1837, so
Yeah.
he was perhaps a little bit too old.
Well, I think he was still writing just before he died, so in theory he could have, but they wouldn't have asked him. He was too much Mozart, Henry.
Yeah, interesting. Well, thank you. So thank you, everyone.